This week we're going to be talking about the delightful subject of Saturn, or in astrology, and specifically Saturn transits to the Sun, because this is really important in medical astrology, and it's also just something that it might be a little bit more, I thought, maybe relatable to people, in the sense that everyone knows their star sign, their sun sign, which is where your sun was when you were born. So when Saturn's going through that sign, there are certain sort of generic features that will crop up for most people during that time. And we could maybe talk a little bit about what those are, in terms of the kinds of experiences people might have and how it might affect their health. And then we might just talk a little bit about remedies and so on. So
Yeah, and
right,
and the timing of these things,
yes,
and is it worth discussing, Marcus, as well, when the Sun transits the natal Saturn the other way around as well?
yeah, I think so. That's kind of so. Yeah, let's start off by distinguishing between those two things. So we've got Saturn transiting the natal sun, which is just to say you are, I don't know, let's pick up a star sign at random. Say you're a Gemini sun. There, your Gemini, your horoscope, Gemini horoscope. So your sun is in Gemini, you're born in Gemini. Then when Saturn is going through Gemini, there will be very strong effects. And that effect won't, so Saturn's in a sign, transits the sign for around 2.5 years. So for the whole of that 2.5 years, there will be some features of Saturn with your sun, but it's going to be much stronger at certain points when it's getting closer and closer to the place your sun was at birth. But similarly, you're also going to feel those Sun-Saturn effects approximately every 7 years when Saturn is in any of the signs that are 90 degrees from Gemini in this instance, or when it's 180 degrees from it. So
And
basically
that's because Saturn takes around 28, 29 years to go the full circle. So that's where you're getting that 7 years from, isn't it?
yes, yeah, exactly. Thank you, Ollie. Yeah, exactly that. So all of that to say, you're going to have that sort of slow cycle of Saturn grinding round and touching the sun, and then you've got the inverse, which you just mentioned, which is when the sun transits your natal Saturn. In other words, where Saturn was when you were born in your birth chart. Saturn might be in a sign. Let's say it's in Cancer, for example. Then, whenever the sun goes through Cancer every year, sort of June, July, or yeah, June, July, it'll at some point go over your natal Saturn, but that will only be active for a couple of days, 2 or 3 days at the most, because that transit of the sun to your natal Saturn, it really only highlights that natal Saturn, for a shorter period of time.
And how long would the transit of Saturn across the natal Sun generally last for a particular for
Well,
anyone
interesting.
able?
I mean, if we so I tend to think that while Saturn is in a sign,
Oh,
the
really?
minute
Okay.
it goes into that sign,
Right.
say where you're born, the sign where your sun is at birth,
Yep.
you're going to start feeling it straight away. I tend
Okay.
to think, but really, obviously, this is a question of, if we're getting technical about the astrology, this is a question of orbs. So Saturn, I think, had an orb of around 9 degrees, so it'd be 4.5 degrees either side. Would be, but all of that's all a bit exact, really. So I'd say as soon as Saturn goes into the sign, you'll start feeling it.
Right.
But
Nice and
then the
easy. Yeah.
closer it gets to the sun, so technically you might say, oh well, there might be 2 or 3 months where Saturn is going over the sun, and then because Saturn is one of the planets that tends to go retrograde, it might sort of steamroller back and forth across the sun 2 or 3 times, or you might be lucky enough just to have it going past once. So for that whole 2.5 year period, there will be some themes of Saturn going over the sun, but they'll only be really intense for maybe a couple of months during that
Right.
time, or a couple of months times three, depending if it goes retrograde over the sun. So, lucky dip, it's, whatever. But so the other way around, the sun going over the Saturn, so obviously the sun goes through the whole zodiac every year, because of the nature of the solar year and all that. you'll maybe only get sort of 12 days in a year where the sun is either, aspecting your natal Saturn in a difficult way. So it's on your natal Saturn for a couple, 2 or 3 days, it's squaring it for 2 or 3 days each time, and then it's opposing it for 2 or 3 days. So like I've just had the sun, my natal Saturn's in Leo. We're filming this in August. Just a couple of days ago, the sun was on my Saturn by transit. So it just gives that flavor for a couple of days. But the inverse,
Right.
when Saturn's in the sign of your sun, that's like a couple of years of the theme. So just to give some sort of keywords. I mean, do you want to sort of kick off with some general themes of Sun, Saturn, Ollie, and then we'll take
Okay.
it
I
in a
mean,
medical direction.
I think in a very general way, I'll start off and then we'll start honing in. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, the nature of the two planets is the sun is obviously our vitality, our what that the core energy of ourselves, and Saturn is a restriction, an oppression, a heavy weight sort of thing. So they're almost like opposites. And
yeah,
so I think any transit of Saturn with the Sun, either way around, there's going to be a depletion of the vital force, if we can call it that, as a basic. And how that manifests, obviously, is what we're going to be looking at in more detail. Um, and I think that's particularly true of the Sun as it goes round, aspecting natal Saturn, that, you've got those 4 days, 4 times a year. And that's like, you look at, and it's quite a good way of learning your medical astrology thing.
yeah,
Have I got, am I feeling a bit depleted these 4 days? That's interesting.
yeah.
Or when you're feeling depleted a few days, look it up. Say, oh, I wonder if that Saturn was, popping into my natal Sun. And
Yes.
it's very easy, as Marcos says, because whatever your sun sign is that's going to be one passed by the sun. When the sun's in the opposite sign, that's going to be another passed by the sun. And when it's in three away from your sign each
Yeah.
direction, that's going to be another pass. So you can literally count 1, 2, 3 each way and 6, and then you've got what the signs are. So, and that gives you the dates.
No,
And
that's perfect. Thanks, Ollie. So you're saying sort of, so some of the themes you touched on there were sort of depletion
yeah,
and fatigue
fatigue.
sort of blocked, and
I
sort of
mean,
you're exactly right. That idea of the sun as one's life energy or vital energy, and Saturn as the sort of force of uh night, really nighttime mortality and
nighttime.
depletion.
I mean, this can be psychological as well. It could be, a melancholia or a depression, because, these are all
Perfect.
things of darkness. The light of, of the day is eclipsed by, heavy Saturn. So it might be you might not feel tired. You might just have a heavy mood.
Yeah.
Often the two go very hand in hand, isn't it? I'm feeling
Oh,
knackered.
oh
I feel
yes, definitely.
crap.
I totally agree, and this that really speaks to the medieval and Greek and earlier sort of humoral concept of melancholy as a physical substance. Because I
Yes.
find that very often, when you have the Sun Saturn, obviously the ancient phrase would be melancholy afflicting the heart, as in
Yes.
you do feel depressed, low vitality, low energy, but you often feel stiff, and there might be just sort of
Yeah.
an
Yeah.
increase in, just feel old. You feel older for those days, like your energy is low. You might have it sort of feels like there's an increase in background inflammation, because Saturn
Yes.
rules retention, so it's like almost like you're retaining more waste. It just feels like that. So it may not be literally the case, in that Sun Saturn isn't a signature for constipation, for example, but it is just that melancholy afflicting the heart, and that sort of combination of sort of chilling influence of Saturn with the sort of potentially inflammatory influence of the Sun
Yes.
is definitely felt. Um, so, I mean, what about some of its real world effects in terms of how it might show up in people's lives? And obviously, we're keeping this very generic, folks, because there are many, many, many different permutations of this. But
Well, I mean, I think one, and again, there's all sorts, but things to look out for. I mean, particularly with transit, it's always going to show up in weak spots. So it's often going to be the return of stuff coming back, sort of thing.
yeah,
That you particularly sort of chronic conditions, because Saturn is a planet of chronic conditions. They're slow, they don't go away. And so I think, going down another level of detail, it's always like, okay, do I have a chronic condition? Is that like, that might be something to look out for getting worse then, because
Yeah, no, Ollie, this is great because that's a hugely important point you've just made. Because when Culpeper, famous astrological herbalist who we both like, in his work, he's talking about sort of doing crisis, like timing medical crises, and he'll talk about timing acute crises, like short-term illnesses using the moon, and long-term or chronic illnesses using the sun. So exactly as you're pointing out, Ollie, that Saturn Sun transit, and this is why we're doing a little mini series focusing on Saturn and the Sun. It's not just so that those of you who only know your sun sign can go, oh, I could look at that. It's also because Saturn is a key planet in medical astrology. It's the significator of chronic disease.
so, and exactly. So, for your clients, even if they don't know when they were born, they're all going to know their birthday, I hope.
Yeah.
So you can always see basically where their Saturn is. And so you can always have a thing, okay, they've got this terrible chronic condition, or not terrible, or a chronic condition. I wonder, maybe it's going to get worse then. Maybe, that's when you should be upping the meds, or saying like, and obviously depending on how open they are to astrological interpretations. But if they are, you could say, this is a time maybe that you need to really keep an eye on your you're taking your meds and your herbs.
Definitely, and even if they're not open to it, you could look at it and go, okay, maybe I'll check in with them at that time.
Yeah, definitely.
Or just be sort of, maybe I might be expecting a phone call or an email from them around this time. Yeah. And so, a few times you can psychologically prime your clients just by saying positive reinforcing stuff, but like, okay, this it might be sometimes, you might have to this next. So if they're not into astrology, you might not be able to say the next couple of months look really hard, but you might be able to say something along the lines of, I think it's normal for things to take a little bit longer.
Yeah.
Or just sort of like, so that they don't despair when the Saturn transit that's going to hit them hits. And so Saturn to the natal Sun is usually a time of depletion and fatigue, whatever. But some of the other things that can crop up are a Sun-Saturn person, somebody who has a natal combination of the Sun and Saturn, often suffers from acute imposter syndrome, which everybody has to some degree or other in some sphere, unless they are a raging narcissist or a sociopath. Yeah. So, most people have it, but to some degree in some situations. But a Sun-Saturn person has
would that be a person with an aspect?
Yes. Sorry, I didn't clarify that. Thank you, Ollie. So that would be somebody who had a birth chart. They were born when Saturn and the Sun were together in the sky or opposing each other, or in signs that were 90 degrees from each other. And particularly when the closer they are in terms of their angularity, the closer that angularity is to 0 degrees or 180 or 90, the more acute that is. So those people who were born with those have that configuration in their birth chart, that those planets were having conversation in the sky when they were born, will have more Sun-Saturn sort of hurdles to get over in that sense. And this is it often shows up as an imposter syndrome, an internal feeling of I'm not good enough, or an external, like literally authority figures saying, are you sure you're good enough at that? And when you have a Saturn transit to your Sun, you often encounter that in the world. I say it to people, it's a time when the world tests you. It's like, or you feel tested. Objectively speaking, the world may be testing you no more or less than it does at any other time, but you feel during that time particularly tested. And that might be because your energy's at a lower ebb, and then just at that particular time, you fail an exam, or you have to go through some tricky negotiation system, or your boss doesn't give you a raise, or, it's often a time when there's difficulties with authority figures. So that can be with your own authority or with external
Well,
authorities.
exactly. I mean, and to put if you a double Saturn, you could be feeling very depressed and miserable for no particular reason. But obviously, if you
Yeah,
then don't get a raise or you feel an exam, that's going to feel much worse than if you're feeling very positive, sort of thing.
100%. And I often think it's, Saturn things are in one sense very predictable. It's Saturn. The beauty of Saturn, and there aren't many times you can say that, but the beauty of Saturn is that you can always see the bus coming over the hill with Saturn. It's like, okay, so we sort of knew this was going to happen.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's that these things sort of creep in, so they're incremental. Doesn't necessarily make them easier to deal with, but it does. It does. You can see them coming along, and Saturn does at the end. There is a useful side to Saturn, in that I just sometimes look at Saturn as the mathematical function of subtraction, and subtraction is necessary because sometimes you have to prune, sometimes you have to edit,
Yes. Yeah.
and sometimes you have to say no, and sometimes you have to be told no. It's just that with a Sun-Saturn, the no feels very personal, and it feels like life is saying no to you
Yeah, because
personally.
obviously the sun is ourself, our vitality. It's our sort of
Yeah,
inner feeling of being, and that Saturn is almost the opposite of that. So it's going to
yes,
really be
exactly.
undermining in that way.
Potentially, absolutely. And we can talk about positive attributes that can be developed in response to Saturn. But one of the functions of Saturn Sun is to test you. And just as being tested, the aim or purpose of being tested is to improve your skill level at
Yes.
something. Then one of the positive responses ultimately to Saturn transit is potentially to improve your skill level at life. It's just that the experience of being tested is often quite a negative one. It's quite a stressful one.
Yes.
And obviously, people vary in their responses to that and in their facility for that.
Well, of course.
So and that you could look at as somebody's natal chart and say, okay, this person may deal better with these kind of Saturny situations than
Yeah.
that person. But also, just anyway, so Saturn Sun has that faculty.
So, Michael, maybe this is a good time to think of some herbs that might be useful for these
Yes, I think that would
situations.
be good. But I also wanted to just mention the
Oh, go on.
medical
Oh,
things,
yes.
the way
Oh,
the way
okay.
this could show up, and then we can move on to
All right.
herbs and
Okay.
remedies
Okay.
and for Sun Saturn. And I thought we ought to close out by just having a look at just a live chart
Oh,
animation
okay. Do you have one
of
to
just
hand?
how Sun and Saturn, so we can illustrate what we mean. But yes, I agree. So medical stuff with Sun and Saturn that may show up. So the Sun represents, as we've talked about, the life force. It's the heart, the physical heart, and the circulation. It's one of the planets that rules the vision or the visual system. So often when Saturn is transiting, and Saturn is blockages and impediments and aging and cold, so there may be at worst there may be heart problems like slowing down of the heart, like extreme cases, particularly in the elderly, might be heart failure or heart block. But generally people tend to feel colder, and their vitality might be a bit lower, immune system might be a bit lower. It's potential also for visual problems. And also, I found things interestingly like viral infections. We'll talk about Mars in a future episode.
That is interesting about because the whole viral thing goes back to sort of terrain theory and who is liable to get
Yes,
is a virus likely to be more
when
likely to
you
catch
run
it when
down,
you're run down
basically.
exactly.
Yes, so I think that's the connection. But I've certainly seen several medical charts with viral infections where the disease has clearly been signified by Saturn, and it's often then it's an infection like a type of influenza. I've seen a
Right.
few. Yeah.
Well, I mean, this might be going too much detail at the moment, but in your experience, is the sign that Saturn's in likely to affect, the stuff that happens? For instance, if Saturn is in Taurus and you get the transit, is that more likely to affect the teeth or the neck sort of
Or
thing?
the neck or the throat.
Yeah,
100%,
right.
absolutely. And we will go into that in future episodes. So there are we're talking in general, the
Yeah.
things like the
No, I just
sun,
wanted to
Saturn
check
is.
just for people. So
Oh yeah,
they can
absolutely.
drill right down into this, really, if one
Yes,
wants
we
to.
will. We will. So,
Excellent.
but just the generic, what you can say generically, no matter what sign your sun is in, and we
Yeah,
are going to
yeah.
go into future like
Oh,
signs
no,
with Saturn
just
transits.
wanted to double check
No, that's
that.
a great point,
Vice
Ollie.
versa as well.
So just in terms of things, there might be problems with the most likely common thing is what we talked about, just feeling tired, feeling depressed, maybe having low vitality in general, feeling a bit cold. But then you've also got this potential for heart or circulatory issues,
Yes.
visual problems. But then there are a multitude of other chronic ailments, as you've said, Ollie, that can often flare up is the wrong word, more like slump down when Saturn
Yeah,
transits, because
yeah,
that's what it
absolutely.
feels like. It feels like your vitality
And this,
ebbs.
from what you're saying, this is much more likely as people get older and older and their vitality gets dimmer, it's going to become
Yeah.
more and more dangerous for them, these things, because
Yes, because I often think
overall,
the passive Saturn is kind of like Saturn has this subtractive function. So
yes.
Saturn with his scythe, it's like each pass, it pairs another little layer off the sun. So it's constantly just paring it down or dimming
Yeah,
its
yeah.
light a little bit. So yeah, I think that's accurate. Um, but that is Saturn's symbolic function
Function,
anyway. So.
absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
And
So remedies, fun stuff. So
remedies.
what have you got any
Well,
suggestions?
yeah, I mean, it's all about sympathy and antipathy, isn't it? Which
Yeah.
I can't remember if we've talked about in this series, but obviously it's something we're deeply interested in. And
Yes.
classically, uh, the antipathy to Saturn is the Sun, and the
Yeah.
Sun is antipathy to Saturn. So, in fact, as you've got both going on, if you're giving a herb of either of those ones in a
Yes.
Saturn Leo situation.
Yeah.
I mean, the one that springs immediately to mind for this would be St. John's Wort for me,
Yes.
which is
Potentially.
all that Saturnian depression. I mean, you obviously it'd be better for a Saturn transit of the Sun because it takes a while to work.
True.
So,
Yeah.
but I like this idea of shiny, everything's gone dark and you're using this very sunny herb to illuminate everything. Just the
Yeah.
symbolism is
Yeah.
like
I,
that.
I agree. We can always that. So this is antipathy. You can always oppose Saturn with the
Exactly.
sun. So just a traditional rule was without if we're not using a chart, we're just using the simple symbolism. So let's keep it simple. You would only use a herbal remedy of Saturn if a Saturn organ was affected. So Saturn traditionally was said to rule or
Yeah.
symbolically represent the skin, the bones, the teeth, and the spleen. So if any of those body parts were affected during that or by that Saturn transit to the sun, then you could get away with using a Saturn herb to treat melancholy. And there are a couple that spring to mind. There's one fumitory, which is great for skin
Dimitri, love
conditions,
it. Yeah, yeah,
which I love, which is it's cooling but clears melancholy, which is a
yeah.
really interesting combo. And the other one, which I've never used, but I tried to grow and it didn't grow, and I really want to get hold of some, is melancholy thistle.
Oh,
Um,
yes, yes,
I
yes,
think
yes.
it's Cirsium heterophyllum, but
That's
I'm
him,
not I'm
yeah.
not sure. But they used to Cole Pepper says boil that up and apparently it makes you as merry as a cricket, he
Oh,
says.
well,
So
goodness me.
so yeah, so
I must
that's a good
immediately try and
Saturn.
find some.
Yeah, so exactly. I really want to grow that. But and then another one that's fallen out of favor because it's highly toxic, but I and doesn't like to grow for me either. And although some other people find it so easy to grow, is hellebore,
Oh, yes.
which is you'd only use in tiny doses, and it's quite a toxic herb. But that was used to treat melancholy as well, and not a Saturn herb. But I totally agree. Solar herbs. And also Jupiter herbs, because Jupiter can count. So my Jupiter herb probably would be, I'd think of borage here,
Yes.
for
Yes.
counteracting that melancholy, particularly if somebody's a bit depressed, and particularly if they feel anxious, depressed, and a bit defeated and lacking and
That's
anxious and
nice. Yeah.
lacking in courage, because the traditional thing was borage brings courage, which I think it does really, in the sense that it sort of lifts you up a little bit. um so that's a Jupiter in Leo plant. But also just generally, Sun, Saturn. Here's a left field one. I wouldn't recommend maybe relying on this as a treatment, but ice wine.
I
Have you
do.
heard of?
I
Yes,
love it. Yes, I don't often get
it's
hold of it.
amazing.
It's like it's yeah,
It's
it's
beautiful stuff. It's
a
but
bit
it's
of a
very,
treat.
yes, yeah. It's very expensive, but it's amazing, and it's wine, as you'll know, Ollie. But it's pressed from frozen grapes. Like the grapes are frozen on the vine, and then they're pressed, and because they're pressed when they're frozen, the juice is very high in the sugars and polyphenols and all the grapey constituents. So it makes kind of like a dessert wine without having to add any extra sugar.
Yes.
So that dessert wine, like ordinary dessert wine, is really syrupy. This has so much flavor. It's such a flavor explosion, and I think it is the perfect Sun-Saturn remedy
Yeah.
because you've literally got grapes traditionally were ruled by the
Right,
sun,
fun,
and
yes.
these are pressed when they are frozen. They're picked in midwinter
What
and
lovely
pressed when they're
sweetness.
frozen.
Yes, yes,
So I've always thought ice wine is the perfect, like, ancient authors would often recommend a small glass of wine
yes,
after dinner or with food to help treat melancholy.
yes.
Well, if you can afford it, because it's 50 quid for a little bottle, then a small glass of ice wine after meals would be amazing. If you're not an alcoholic, you don't have liver problems, all the rest of it. But it's that. So that that's one really left
I will
field.
look forward to the NHS prescribing it Monday.
Yeah, I think we might be waiting a while. But yeah, I mean, there are other suggestions, but this is sort of we might get a bit more particular. But some Sun Saturn sort of remedies. So anything which will gently increase or sustain vitality
Yes,
would be good. So that generally you're looking at things that are a bit like foods that are a bit more warming and moistening, sort of
yes.
like soups and brothy things to warm people up. Um, but I like your St. John's wort, Ollie. I just think chamomile as well. Chamomile's another
Chamomile.
brilliant
Everybody loves
solar one.
chamomile. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Should we just have a quick look? I just want to
Yeah,
do a
let's have a
quick
look at the
share.
chart. Let's see if people can see where the sun is
Yeah.
going this year and
Yeah,
where Saturn's
exactly.
heading.
Exactly. Let's see if I can just do a quick share of my screen. Just got up this chart where I've just got the chart on the inner wheel is the same really as the chart on the outer wheel, but they're both what's going on in the sky today. But we're going to treat the chart on the inner wheel with the sun at 27 Leo and Saturn at 17 Pisces as if it's a birth chart. And we've got the ascendant at 0 Scorpio. And we're going to imagine that that's a birth chart. And we're going to treat the Sun and Saturn going around this chart as transiting planets. So if we move this a year into the future, you'll see that Saturn has jumped into Aries. So if you move that 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. So 7 years, it's in Gemini, which is squaring Pisces, where it was initially. In fact, as you can see, it went into Gemini just after 6 years. So if I wind it back a few months, Saturn will go into Gemini in sometime in June 2030.
And now,
So
would you say that is hang on, let me just get this right.
well,
No, it's
that's just showing where Saturn has moved
not.
90
Okay.
degrees from its own position. But really, what we'll be looking at with
Yes.
Saturn to the natal sun.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. So you're right. We'd be looking at Saturn in Taurus, wouldn't we? So
We
that would
would.
be, so Saturn moves into Taurus
Then,
in April 2028. So that's approximately 4 years from now. It's in Taurus, which is going to be, as soon as it goes into Taurus in around April 2028, Saturn will be squaring by sign that sun in Leo. But it's
so
actually,
that might start to be a bit of depression as a life force. And
yes.
obviously, and that, yeah, and as the sun, yeah. Go
So
on, anyway.
all the things we were talking about earlier, really, but because the Saturn is still very far away from that square of the sun, that's going to be relatively mild initially, and then it's going to gradually build up over the months. You can see during this time, Saturn goes forward and then backwards, and then forwards and then backwards. And by June 2029, that Saturn is really starting to come closer and closer to that 90-degree aspect away from the
Yeah.
sun. So, and it in fact goes backwards again, and then it goes forwards, and then here we go, around May 2030. So for
Yeah.
May 2030, it's going to exactly square that sun. And then it pops off into Gemini and it goes retrograde, but it doesn't come back into Taurus. So then we're, that this person, say it's somebody who's born nowish, would be safe from that Sun-Saturn influence until Saturn went into Leo, which would happen in 2034. So September 2034, and the same pattern would repeat itself. So
it's interesting because of the retrograde movement to Saturn, as I remember, I think they would have been about 6 when they first got the square, and then they're about 10 now at 34.
Yes, so that's interesting. So even though we said the squares are approximately every 7 years, if we look at the exact squares, there is some variability, as you've said. So like if we looked at the exact squares or conjunctions or oppositions, so this is going to be a conjunction where Saturn is going to conjoin the sun. The previous one was a square when it was in Taurus. So if I went back a few years to when it was, and it was exact in, I think we said May 2030. So yes, that would be approximately
5 years, 8 months, and 5 years.
May 2030. That's 6 years, isn't it? August 2024 to
about
May.
6 years. Yeah, my math.
Just under 6.
Under 6 years. Yeah.
Yeah, just under 6 years. Let's say is when that would be happening. That's the exact, and then let's dial it forward to when Saturn is. But as I say, when Saturn goes into Leo, from that sometime in 2035, as soon as it goes into Leo, the sign where the sun is at birth, that some Sun-Saturn events will start happening, but then it's not going to be, it's going to get more and more intense until the exact point is September 2036.
Which would be about 12 years. So, 12 years and a month. So that took a bit longer, didn't it?
That took a little bit longer. So it's interesting. So we've said approximately every 7 years, but really the exact aspects can be a little bit sooner than that. Let's dial it to the next quarter. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Interesting. So this is going to be longer. This is going to be, so you see Saturn went into Scorpio in summer 2042, I think.
2020, yeah.
It will go. It hasn't happened yet. So Saturn will go into Scorpio in, looks like July 2042, but then it won't actually become exact until January 2044.
44, yeah.
So,
which is 20 years, just about just under 20 years. So
it's 20 years, but
3 points have taken about 20 years, or 19 and a half years. So it's and so this took longer. The other ones were.
So this is interesting. The previous ones were like just under 6 months, just under 6 years rather. Then around 6 years and change. And now we're sort of more like 7 and a bit or something like that, aren't we? Yeah. So it's going to add up to be roughly every 7 years, but depending on, the transits, the exact times of the transits, they may be slightly shorter or slightly longer. And then Saturn will be opposing the sun, the natal sun, so-called, in it enters Aquarius in late 2050, and then it will be exact in December 2052.
Right.
So, we started in 2024, so 2034.
26 years.
Is it? Is that right? So
no, probably not. My maths is terrible.
My maths is appalling as well.
Plus 2 is 28 years, so almost exactly right.
Okay, we're good.
We're good.
The math is mathing.
Bang on time.
Yeah, the math is
all added up.
So that's good. So this is just an illustration of Saturn transiting the natal sun. So as you can see, because Saturn hangs around in any of those signs that are in hard aspect to the sun, so-called. So the sign where the sun is at birth, signs which are 90 degrees either side, and the sign which is opposite it. That Saturn hang around in that sign for 2.5 years approximately. And even though the exact transit may only be a couple of months during that time, the influence will be felt for a lot of that time period. The other way round, as you'll see, the sun has been zipping round the chart. If we looked at the natal, let's just do 1 year around this time. So we've got the sun squaring natal Saturn in this year. Well, let's just return to the natal the natal one. So we've got here from now, we've got the sun will oppose the so-called natal Saturn in, I think, September.
Yeah.
So we've got around the 8th and 9th of September. There'll be a couple of days when that influence will be felt. Then we'll be looking at the 7th and 8th of December in the same year. Then we'll be looking at around the 6th and 7th of March.
Yeah.
And finally,
all the way around.
We'll get to Gemini, we'll be looking around the 6th and 7th of June. But for the first 3 of those, that influence will be doubly intense at the moment because, of course, Saturn will be in the sky, yes, hanging around in Pisces, reinforcing that aspect. So this one next year for this new person will be a lot easier. But anyway, I hope that hasn't confused people. I hope that's actually helped to illustrate things, but we shall see.
Okay, Marcus, we should probably
yes, we should, I think,
for this episode and return to it in a couple of weeks, because I think there's lots more to be said.
Yes, there is. Loads more to be said.
Excellent way to well, not only help your patients and see it's critical times for them, but also for newcomers to astrology to get a feel for the actual movements of the heavens rather than the chart as a static thing.
Yes, exactly. And I think what we'll do next time is we'll maybe have a look at Saturn affecting people with their suns in the so-called cardinal or movable signs.
That would be nice.
So,
yes.
Yeah. So we'll start off with that. Anyway, excellent. Thanks, Olly.
Thank you very much. I'll see you in a couple of weeks, Marcos.
Bye. Bye.